For weeks now, it feels like the entire world has been holding its breath, just watching this incredibly high-stakes showdown unfold between the United States and Iran. So let's unpack exactly how we got here, to the absolute brink of a massive conflict.
It really all kicks off right here, on the streets of Iran. Starting back in late December of 2025, this huge wave of protests, just fueled by sheer economic desperation, completely swept the nation. And this wasn't some small, isolated movement. We're talking all 31 provinces. The government's response? It was absolutely brutal, leading to thousands and thousands of casualties.
And then the United States made its position, well, crystal clear. On January 2nd, President Trump dropped this bombshell on social media. It was a direct, unambiguous threat signaling a very real potential for American intervention, which just dramatically raised the stakes for everyone.
So that's the big question, isn't it? How on earth did we get here? How did we go from what was supposed to be a landmark diplomatic deal just a few years ago to this incredibly tense standoff? To really understand that, we've got to trace the chain of events that brought us to this exact moment.
So our story really begins with the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. This was an agreement that was meant to forge a whole new path forward, but instead, it became the first major casualty in what turned out to be a decade of escalating hostility. What's just wild is how fast this whole thing fell apart. 2015, that deal was the high point. But then, just 3 years later, boom, the U.S. pulls out and slaps sanctions right back on. Tensions just spike with the assassination of General Soleimani in 2020. And then a huge military escalation in June 2025. The U.S. actually joins Israel in direct strikes on Iranian nuclear sites during what people now call the 12-day war. You can literally see how each step just systematically tore apart any chance for diplomacy and shoved both sides closer to a real all-out conflict.
But see, the breakdown of that nuclear deal wasn't just political. It set off a devastating collapse of the Iranian economy. And that is the direct fuse for the protests we're seeing today. This number, it pretty much says it all. As sanctions got tighter and tighter between 2012 and 2024, Iran's GDP per capita, which is basically a measure of the average person's economic well-being, it just plummeted by $3,000. That is a catastrophic drop in the standard of living for everyday Iranians.
And if you want to know what that economic pain actually looks like in real life, here it is. In early 2026, Iran's currency, the rial, hit a disastrous new low, $1.5 million to a single US dollar. Can you just imagine your entire life savings being wiped out practically overnight?
And make no mistake, this was not some unfortunate side effect. As this quote from the U.S. Treasury Secretary makes perfectly clear, the economic pressure was a deliberate, calculated policy. The stated goal was to literally bankrupt the regime, leaving it with, as he says, neither economic nor national security.
This economic warfare created just immense real-world suffering for ordinary people. We're talking about runaway inflation that makes food unaffordable, a crippling lack of jobs, cancer patients who can't get essential treatment, and even commercial airplanes being grounded because the country can't get basic spare parts. It created an absolute powder keg of discontent.
And that powder keg, well, it finally exploded. The deep, deep economic pain boiled over into the largest and most sustained challenge to the regime's authority that we have seen in years.
The government's response was just overwhelmingly violent. This chart really paints a stark picture of just how lopsided this crackdown was. As of mid-January, over 2,400 protesters were reported killed, compared to just 147 security forces. It's a grim, clear picture of a regime using lethal force to cling to power.
So you might be asking, Iran's had protests before, so why is this time different? Well, it comes down to two huge reasons. First, the government is flat broke. It can't just throw money at the problem to calm people down. And second, its key regional allies, like Hezbollah and the Assad regime in Syria, have been seriously weakened, leaving Tehran more isolated and more vulnerable than ever before.
Okay, so this brings us right back to the U.S. response. With President Trump's locked and loaded threat hanging in the air, what are the actual military options being kicked around inside the White House?
From what strategists are saying, it looks like there are three main scenarios. The first option is a limited symbolic strike. Just enough to show they're serious and to try and force Iran to the negotiating table. The second option is a bit more targeted, hitting the regime's security forces, like the IRGC, to make it harder for them to crush the protests. And then you have option three, the most severe, intensive military strikes to wipe out major assets like Iran's missile program. Each one carries a wildly different level of risk. And this, right here, is the absolute heart of the crisis. Facing a potential U.S. attack, Iran has a very short list of incredibly risky options, and each one could lead to a dramatically different and dangerous outcome.
This table really lays out the impossible dilemma for Tehran. Okay, so it could attack U.S. bases, but that would almost certainly trigger a massive American response, maybe even a push for regime change. Or it could attack Israel, which risks a full-blown regional war. It could try to close the Strait of Hormuz, a critical global oil route, but that would shock the entire world economy and probably invite even more international intervention. Or it could try diplomacy, but that would mean making huge concessions from a position of serious weakness. There are literally no good choices here.
And then, just when it seemed like a conflict was all but guaranteed, a potential off-ramp appeared out of nowhere. In the last days of January and early February, officials from both the U.S. and Iran actually confirmed that they were working on arrangements for negotiations. It was this sudden, unexpected glimmer of hope for a diplomatic way out of this after weeks right on the brink.
So that's where we stand today, a nation in turmoil, two adversaries circling each other, and this very fragile, very tentative first step towards talking. It all really boils down to one final critical question.
After a decade of broken deals, economic collapse, and military strikes, the entire fate of the region is just hanging in the balance. With these new negotiations set against a backdrop of full military readiness, the world is just holding its breath, waiting to see which one is going to win out, diplomacy or force.